Well, hey there. It's Pastor Brandon here with a midweek message for you on Thursday. Today, I had some issues at the church this week, and I wasn't able to get it done yesterday like I wanted, but here we are. Recently, I've been listening to the soundtrack to the show Les Miserables. I love that book, and I love the musical, and then the songs are just incredible. And if you're not familiar with the story of Les Miserables, it's there's really the story of a guy named Jean Valjean and the child that he's tasked with caring for. And Jean spent 19 years in prison for stealing a loaf of bread and came out embittered and angry. And then one night, he enters a church or a monastery of some sort, and he's taken in and given shelter, and then decides to steal the silver from the church in the middle of the night and run, because he knows that he's a marked man. He knows that because of his criminal past and because of his what he has done, he's never going to be able to make a living for himself. And so he feels driven to stealing, something he never thought he would have to do. Only he's caught. And the authorities bring him back to the church, and they bring him before the bishop. And the bishop there hears from the authorities that Jean has said the bishop gave him the silver, trying to escape the authorities. And now, caught in the middle of his own lies, Jean knows what's going to happen. He is going to get sent to prison for the rest of his life, if not executed. And the bishop looks at him, and he says, "My son, you forgot the best." And the bishop tells the authorities, "Yes, he did. I did give these things to him, but he forgot to take the communion servers. He forgot to take the other things that I gave him." And the authorities there are obviously perplexed and dismayed. They can't believe that this is really true, that a bishop would give away the silver of the church to a criminal. And the authorities leave at the word of the bishop. And then we cut to a scene in which John is in a little chapel in the church, and he's singing. And he's singing of his anger and his hatred and of the bitterness that he had over 19 years spent for stealing a loaf of bread, 19 years of hard labor in prison. And he also begins to sing of the grace of God shown to him through this bishop. And he vows that night to give his life to God and to serve his neighbor, to serve his community. And it's this amazing picture of grace at work. It's this incredible story of redemption, of a man whose life was over, a man who knew that he was under the thumb of the law and would never escape, that it would always be on him, that it would always be pursuing him, and yet a man who received the grace of God and who was changed and transformed by that grace. And as I've been listening to this, and I was listening to it with my daughter in the car, and she was asking me what was happening during each song, and my son was there too, and he wasn't paying so much attention to what I was saying, except that I began to cry as I described this story of grace. And he said, "Daddy, are you crying? Why are you crying?" And I said, "Because it's so wonderful. It's so amazing." But in the moment that my son asked me why I was crying, and I was trying to explain to my daughter the beauty of this grace, it struck me, the great irony struck me that here I am crying over this act of transformative grace from this show and this book, and yet all too often with my own children, I am the taskmaster. I am the lawmaster. I am the law keeper. I don't show them grace, but I continually pound the law to them. And there are days when they feel like they could never get out from under the oppressive thumb of their father, like they could never do anything right. And it breaks my heart to think that my children feel that way around me, but I know they do. I know there are those days when I'm so hard on them because I think that's what they need. They need to grow. They need to learn. They need to perform. Now, God has felt the same way about us. God knew that the law could not transform us. Oh, he gave it a chance. He gave us the law to lead us to himself, to show us the riches of his grace. He gave us grace first. and then the law. God always knew that the law couldn't fix us. It couldn't transform us. It couldn't make us holy. We would always feel under the oppressive thumb of a law. You see, God is not a taskmaster. God is not an oppressor. God is not one who puts us down. God is one who frees us. And so knowing that the law could not save us, and knowing that we had twisted the law from what it was supposed to be, which was the guide for how people restored by God's grace should live, into a set of checklists by which we can know if we're in His grace. God, knowing that we would do that with the law, had a plan from the beginning, a quite different plan than what we would imagine, or than even how I treat my children. And we find that plan in Romans chapter 8. And so I want you to listen to these few verses, and we'll wrap up here. Therefore, 8:1. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus, because the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set you free from the law of sin and death. What the law could not do, since it was weakened by the flesh, God did. He condemned sin in the flesh by sending His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh as a sin offering, in order that the law's requirement would be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. God looked down and He saw that we, in our flesh, as Paul puts it here, had twisted the law, made it something that it wasn't supposed to be, a checklist by which we would know if God loves us, or by which we would know if we're in God's plan and in God's people. That was never the intent of the law, and God saw what we had done to His good and spiritual law through our flesh, through our bodies, through our tendencies, and God said, you know what? They need a stronger law. You know what? They need more oppression. They need a tighter thumb. They need me to come down really hard on them, and then they'll understand. Then they'll get it. Then they'll start performing properly. No, that's what I do with my kids. That's what we do with poor performing employees. That's what we do with people who don't live up to our expectations. We say, well, clearly the stick wasn't strong enough, and so I need a bigger stick. But God looks down at us, looks at us holding all of our sticks over one another, looks at us holding all our thumbs down, trying to oppress one another, looks at us in all of our big-headed power, and says, no, you don't need another law. You don't need a stronger law. You don't need a bigger stick. What you need is my Spirit. What you need is my grace. What you need is my love. What you need is something that you can't get on your own, something you can't make within yourself, something you can't perform your way into. And so God, looking down at us who had perverted His law, looking down at us who had totally misunderstood Him and rejected Him, instead of saying they need a stronger law, they need me to come down harder on them, said, I'm going to give them my very Spirit. I'm going to send my Son to them, and He will die, and sin will die in Him. And then I will birth in these people my very Spirit. I'll give them my very breath of life. I will give them who I am. God looked at us who had changed everything He had ever said. God looked at us who had misunderstood Him, who had rejected Him, who had turned away, who had perverted what He had said, and He gave us Himself. He died for us, rose again for us. He reigns in grace and mercy over you and me. Our good King Jesus comes as our King, and He doesn't give us a tighter law. He gives us His Spirit. He gives us His grace. And then He empowers us to live for Him, because He knows that the stick won't work. The shackles don't work. The prison of law doesn't work. And so there I am in my car, explaining this story of transformative grace to the children that I all too often oppress with my own law and my own ego, weeping, because I know the story of grace, and I know how I do not live it, because I know the power of grace. I know the power of God's Spirit. I've experienced it for myself, and I don't pass it on. Today, let's be people of grace. who understand that a bigger stick is not the way to get people to perform, but it is God's grace that transforms our hearts. It's God's grace that transforms a people. It's God's love lived out through you and me. Today, let's challenge ourselves not to walk in the way of those authorities from the story of Jean Valjean, not to walk in the way of the jailers, the lawmasters, but instead, like the bishop, to be a conduit of God's love and grace, so that we can be the agents of God's transformation in the people around us.